Innocent but imprisoned. How the justice system gets it wrong. The cell door closed on a man the system believed it understood. There was no weapon, no DNA match, no confession that survived scrutiny. Yet the verdict was certain. Guilty. Years later, the evidence would say something very different. But by then, the damage was already permanent. This is not a story about crime. It is a story about certainty and what happens when certainty is wrong. This documentary is created strictly for educational and informational purposes. All scenes, narration, and descriptions are presented in a responsible and respectful manner. No graphic content or harmful behavior is shown or encouraged. This video complies with YouTube's community guidelines, and all sensitive topics discussed are handled with care and neutrality. Viewer discretion is advised due to the real-life nature of prison environments. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd really love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime documentaries like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who would enjoy it too. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories to life. Wrongful convictions don't begin with malice. They begin with confidence. Confidence in memory. Confidence in procedures. Confidence that the system, built by rules and professionals, cannot fail in obvious ways. But research, court records, and exoneration data reveal a quieter truth. Many innocent people are convicted not because the system is broken, but because it works exactly as designed under pressure. This documentary examines how ordinary investigative decisions, courtroom psychology, and institutional incentives combine to produce extraordinary injustice. Not hypotheticals, not rare accidents, real cases, real people, real consequences. The moment the story locks in, every wrongful conviction begins with a moment most people never notice. It's not the arrest. It's not the trial. It's the moment when a story hardens. In the early hours of an investigation, information is incomplete and chaotic. Investigators are trained to reduce that chaos quickly. According to research cited by the National Institute of Justice, once a narrative begins to form, the human brain naturally prioritizes information that confirms it and unconsciously dismisses information that complicates it. This is not corruption. It's cognition. Psychologists call it confirmation bias. In policing and prosecution, it becomes decisive. In multiple exoneration cases later reviewed by independent commissions, investigators reported feeling certainty early, sometimes within the first interview, sometimes after a single witness statement. From that point on, the investigation no longer asked who committed the crime, but how to prove the chosen suspect did. One exoneree described it this way after release. Once they decided it was me, everything I said became evidence against me. Silence meant guilt. Talking meant I was lying. Studies referenced by the American Psychological Association show that once suspicion is established, ambiguous behavior, nervousness, confusion, inconsistent memory, is interpreted as deception, even though these reactions are common in innocent people under stress. This is especially dangerous during interrogations. In several documented cases, individuals with no criminal history were questioned for hours, sometimes days. They were isolated, deprived of normal time cues, and repeatedly told that evidence already proved their guilt, even when it did not exist. Under these conditions, false confessions emerge not because someone wants to confess, but because the mind seeks escape. Psychologist Craig Haney's work on coercive environments demonstrates that prolonged pressure alters decision-making. The brain shifts from long-term consequence evaluation to immediate relief. Saying yes feels safer than enduring another hour. And once a confession exists, even a false one, it becomes the spine of the case. Jurors are told confessions are rare unless guilt is real. Judges trust them. Appeals courts defer to them. But exoneration data repeatedly shows that confessions are among the most powerful and most misleading forms of evidence. The story has now locked in. From this point forward, every procedural safeguard meant to protect the innocent begins working in reverse. and the person at the center of the case hasn't even been sentenced yet. When memory becomes evidence, by the time a case reaches court, the story no longer feels fragile. It feels complete. Jurors are told they will hear facts. What they actually encounter is memory, filtered, rehearsed, and reshaped by time, authority, and expectation. Eyewitness testimony has long been treated as one of the strongest forms of evidence. Someone saw something. Someone remembers a face. Someone is certain. But decades of psychological research reveal a troubling reality. Human memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. The American Psychological Association has repeatedly demonstrated that memory is malleable, especially under stress. High adrenaline events narrow attention. Peripheral details fade. Faces blur. Time fragments. What remains is often confidence without accuracy. In wrongful conviction cases later overturned, witnesses frequently expressed unwavering certainty at trial. Years later, when DNA or new evidence proved innocence, many were genuinely shocked. They were not lying. They were remembering incorrectly. One ex-Eniri recalled sitting in the courtroom, watching a stranger point at him and say, "That's the man." He said later, "I could see it in her face." She believed it. This belief matters. Jurors equate confidence with truth. Studies cited by the National Institute of Justice show that confident witnesses are significantly more persuasive, even when their identification is wrong. The legal system has struggled to account for this cognitive gap. The problem deepens during identification procedures. In numerous cases reviewed by the National Registry of Exonerations, photo lineups were conducted in ways that subtly steered witnesses toward a suspect. The suspect's photo stood out. The officer administering the lineup knew who police believed was guilty. Feedback, even as small as a nod or a pause, reinforced selection. Psychologists call this memory contamination. Once a witness selects a face, their memory begins to rewrite itself. The original mental image is replaced by the chosen photograph. Subsequent recollections feel clearer, more detailed, more certain, even though they are now anchored to a mistake. By trial, the witness is no longer recalling the crime. They are recalling the identification. This creates a powerful illusion of reliability. In one reviewed case, a man was convicted almost entirely on eyewitness testimony. There was no physical evidence, no forensic link, no confession. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours. Years later, DNA evidence excluded him completely. When asked how they could have been so wrong, the witnesses didn't describe doubt. They described shock. The justice system often treats these outcomes as tragic anomalies. But psychological research suggests they are predictable. Stress impairs encoding. Time degrades recall. Authority influences interpretation. And once a case advances, correcting memory becomes nearly impossible. Defense attorneys face an uphill battle. Challenging a witness's memory can appear aggressive, even cruel. Jurors may empathize with the witness and resent the implication that they are mistaken. Judges often limit expert testimony on memory, concerned it will confuse the jury. The result is a courtroom where the least reliable evidence is sometimes given the most weight. But eyewitness error is only part of the picture. In several high-profile exonerations, faulty forensic practices played a silent role. Hair comparison, bite mark analysis, and early fingerprint interpretation were once presented as near scientific certainty. Later reviews by independent labs, including findings associated with the Chicago Crime Lab and federal oversight bodies, revealed error rates that were never disclosed at trial. Jurors heard the word science. They assumed precision. What they received was interpretation, often subjective, sometimes overstated, and rarely challenged. Once testimony like this enters the record, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to undo. Appeals courts do not reweigh evidence. They defer to the original fact-finders. New science struggles to compete with old certainty. For the accused, this marks a psychological shift. Inmates later exonerated often describe the trial as the moment they realized truth was no longer enough. They had believed facts would protect them, that innocence would be obvious. When the verdict came back guilty, many experienced a profound cognitive collapse, a sudden understanding that logic had lost its power. Psychologists describe this as institutional betrayal. The very system meant to determine truth has now declared a false reality official. From this point forward, the individual is no longer fighting an accusation. They are fighting a record that will follow them into sentencing, into prison, into years where innocence becomes an identity that no one is obligated to believe. And yet, paradoxically, this is also the moment when the long path toward exoneration truly begins, quietly, invisibly, and against overwhelming odds. Because once memory becomes evidence, overturning it requires something stronger than belief. It requires proof that cannot forget. Living inside a false verdict. Prison does not begin at the gate. It begins at the moment the verdict becomes permanent. For the wrongfully convicted, incarceration carries a psychological burden distinct from guilt or remorse. There is no internal narrative that explains the punishment. No moral framework that explains the pain. Only contradiction. You are punished for something that did not happen. Research referenced by psychologists studying incarceration, including work associated with Craig Haney and John Irwin, shows that meaning is a critical survival tool in confinement. People endure hardship better when suffering can be rationalized as consequence, as penance, as temporary. Innocence removes that anchor. One exoneree described his first night in prison as disorienting rather than terrifying. He said, "I kept waiting for someone to realize the mistake." That realization never came. Inside prison, innocence is not protective. It can be dangerous. Correctional environments operate on informal social rules. Accountability, reputation, and perceived honesty determine safety. Claiming innocence can be interpreted as denial, arrogance, or refusal to accept responsibility. In some housing units, that perception invites isolation or hostility. As a result, many wrongfully convicted inmates learn to stay silent, not just legally, but psychologically. They stop asserting innocence aloud. They stop explaining. They stop hoping that explanation will matter. This silence has consequences. Long-term studies on incarceration psychology indicate that sustained cognitive dissonance, holding an internal truth that is constantly contradicted by external reality, leads to chronic stress responses, sleep disruption, emotional numbing, hypervigilance, depression. Unlike guilty inmates who may work toward rehabilitation programs or sentence reductions, the innocent face a paradox. Admitting guilt can unlock privileges, parole consideration, and access to programs. Maintaining innocence can close those doors indefinitely. Several exonerees later reported being advised, sometimes explicitly, that acceptance of responsibility was the fastest path home. The message was clear. Truth was negotiable. Freedom was conditional. For many, this becomes the most corrosive psychological moment of all. To survive, some adopt what psychologists call strategic compliance, outward conformity paired with internal resistance. They follow rules meticulously, avoid conflict, observe more than they speak. Over time, this vigilance becomes habitual, but vigilance has a cost. Research on long-term confinement shows that constant self-monitoring erodes identity. Individuals begin to define themselves less by who they are and more by what they must avoid. The future collapses into routine. Time loses texture. One man later exonerated after decades described prison years as blank pages. He could not remember entire stretches of time. Not because nothing happened, but because nothing was allowed to matter. Appeals move slowly. Evidence requests are denied. Legal language becomes abstract. Innocence projects are understaffed. Courts defer to finality. The system prioritizes closure over correction. This creates a second injustice, procedural exhaustion. The wrongfully convicted are told that the system values accuracy, yet experience a structure that resists revision. New evidence must meet thresholds higher than those required to convict in the first place. Credibility is questioned. Memory is doubted. Motive is scrutinized. Ironically, The very psychological symptoms caused by wrongful incarceration, emotional flatness, fragmented memory, guarded behavior, can be used to undermine claims of innocence. Inside prison, identity fractures. Some exonerees report dividing themselves into two versions. The person who existed before conviction and the person who survives incarceration. Letters home become shorter. Hope becomes quieter. The mind adapts not by fighting reality, but by shrinking within it. And yet, amid this compression, something persists. In several documented cases later overturned through forensic review or investigative reinvestigation, inmates continued to file handwritten motions, copied transcripts by hand, studied case law in libraries designed for punishment, not preparation. Psychologists describe this as cognitive resistance, the refusal to allow an imposed narrative to fully overwrite internal truth. It is fragile. It is exhausting, but it is often the only thing that survives intact. Years later, when exoneration finally arrives, sometimes through DNA testing, sometimes through witness recantation, sometimes through exposure of procedural failure, the moment is not always euphoric. Many exonerees describe numbness. Freedom does not restore what uncertainty erased. They walk out carrying decades of adaptation that no longer fit the outside world. Trust is cautious. Time feels distorted. Simple choices feel overwhelming. The system that once controlled every aspect of life is suddenly absent. Psychologists studying post-exoneration adjustment note symptoms similar to institutionalization and trauma exposure. Relief exists alongside grief. Grief for years lost, relationships altered, identities paused. The verdict is gone, but its psychological imprint remains. And this raises a final, uncomfortable question. If the system can take decades to correct a mistake it made in months, what responsibility remains after freedom is restored? That question is where accountability truly begins. The long road to exoneration. Exoneration is rarely sudden. It is not a single moment of vindication, but a painstaking, multi-layered process that tests the resilience, patience, and ingenuity of those wrongfully convicted. For every exoneree, the path is a maze of legal hurdles, bureaucratic inertia, and psychological warfare. The first barrier is evidence. In many wrongful conviction cases, critical evidence was overlooked, mishandled, or misinterpreted. Convictions often rest on eyewitness testimony, confessions extracted under duress, or forensic methods later proven flawed. According to the National Institute of Justice, NIJ, eyewitness misidentification accounts for nearly 70% of DNA exoneration cases in the United States. But discovering this error is only the beginning. Inmates must navigate a legal system that is inherently resistant to admitting mistakes. Many prison lawyers are overburdened. Public defenders have little time or resources to revisit decades-old cases. For the innocent, every motion is an uphill climb, every appeal a battle against the inertia of finality. The Chicago Crime Lab has documented cases where simple procedural oversights, lost evidence, delayed filings, or denied DNA testing requests prolonged wrongful imprisonment for years, sometimes decades. Exonerees often rely on a network of advocacy. Innocence projects, legal clinics, and journalists dedicated to uncovering systemic failures. The California Innocence Project has highlighted the interplay between forensic innovation and persistent advocacy in overturning convictions. DNA testing, while transformative, cannot retroactively correct every error. Some cases require re-examining witness credibility or uncovering prosecutorial misconduct. Yet the legal battle is only half the story. The psychological toll of sustained hope and repeated disappointment cannot be overstated. Studies by the APA and researchers like Craig Haney show that chronic uncertainty and lack of perceived control exacerbate trauma. Inmates know that a single misstep, a missed filing, a poorly worded motion, a dismissive judge, can delay freedom indefinitely. Many report internalizing the legal system's indifference, experiencing anxiety, hopelessness, and self-doubt alongside the persistent knowledge of their innocence. Inside the prison walls, hope becomes a careful, almost secretive act. Some inmates maintain detailed journals, tracking legal deadlines, correspondence, and evidence. Others forge alliances with fellow inmates who have connections to lawyers, reporters, or advocacy organizations. Every strategy is calibrated for survival, every action measured against the risk of wasted effort. The process is relentless, exhausting, and deeply isolating. When exoneration finally comes, it is often mediated through external validation rather than internal revelation. DNA results, witness recantations, or newly discovered evidence act as the system's permission to release what it once imprisoned. Yet, studies show that the moment of release is not universally joyous. In fact, psychologists highlight a phenomenon known as freedom shock. Decades of conditioned compliance, hypervigilance, and psychological adaptation do not disappear with a verdict. Exonerees often report disorientation, difficulty making decisions, and a lingering fear that injustice could return at any moment. Consider the case of Anthony Ray Hinton, wrongfully convicted of murder in Alabama. Hinton spent 30 years on death row before his release. Despite the victory of exoneration, he described the adjustment to freedom as walking into a world I no longer recognized. Time inside prison had shaped every instinct, every expectation, every perception of safety. Freedom was not simply leaving the building. It was learning to live in a reality that had moved on without him. The consequences extend beyond the individual. Families endure the agony of watching their loved ones punished for crimes they did not commit. Relationships fray or collapse under years of separation, compounded by the stigma of conviction. Children grow up with absent parents. Spouses navigate prolonged uncertainty, and communities confront both the injustice and the media narrative surrounding the conviction. In response, some states have created compensation statutes, yet these vary widely. California, for example, provides financial restitution for each year of wrongful incarceration, while other states offer minimal or no compensation. Even where financial restitution exists, it cannot undo the psychological, social, and developmental harm caused by years lost to an unjust system. The broader implications are profound. Wrongful convictions reveal systemic flaws, over-reliance on eyewitness testimony, racial and socioeconomic bias, inadequate legal representation, and institutional inertia. The APA and other criminal justice scholars have repeatedly emphasized that each exoneration should be treated as a case study, offering insights to prevent future miscarriages of justice. Yet, public attention often wanes after the headlines fade, leaving most cases unexamined. And this is the paradox. Exoneration, while a triumph of truth, also exposes how deeply a system can fail. It highlights resilience and ingenuity, yes, but it also illuminates the silent suffering, the psychological scars, and the lasting impact of a life wrongfully confined. Inside prison walls, the story of the wrongfully convicted is not just about crime and punishment. It is about identity, endurance, and the human mind's remarkable capacity to survive contradiction. These stories challenge our assumptions about justice, compel us to question the reliability of our systems, and demand recognition of the profound cost of error. The battle for freedom is legal, psychological, and moral. The exonerated emerge not only as survivors of injustice, but as living reminders of its consequences. Their stories are critical, not sensational, and each case carries lessons that reverberate far beyond prison walls. Life after exoneration, the hidden struggle. Freedom. For those who have spent years behind bars for crimes they did not commit, is a word loaded with both relief and trepidation. The door opens, and yet the world outside has changed in ways that are often disorienting. Post-exoneration life is not an instant redemption. It is a complex, ongoing negotiation between past trauma, societal reintegration, and personal identity reconstruction. The first challenge is psychological reintegration. Decades of wrongful incarceration imprint deep patterns of hypervigilance, distrust, and learned compliance. Researchers like Craig Haney and Irwin, 2005, highlight that even after release, exonerees often exhibit institutionalized behaviors, such as extreme sensitivity to authority, difficulty managing unstructured time, and challenges in decision-making. Every social interaction can trigger residual trauma from confinement. The tone of a voice, a glance, or an unexpected delay can evoke the stress responses honed over years behind concrete walls. Depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, are common. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, post-release studies, over 80% of exonerees report persistent psychological effects, often severe enough to interfere with work, relationships, and day-to-day functioning. One exoneree described it as being free in body but trapped in mind. Even joy is complicated. It must compete with years of lost milestones, stolen relationships, and delayed personal development. Financial instability adds another layer of hardship. While some states provide compensation, California offers roughly $140 per day of wrongful incarceration. The reality is often inadequate. After decades removed from employment, skills, and social networks, exonerees face economic vulnerability. Securing housing, healthcare, and employment requires navigating a world that has moved on without them, while carrying the lingering label of a former prisoner. Relationships, too, are fraught with complexity. Families may have held on through decades of uncertainty, but dynamics often shift. Children may have grown up distant, spouses may have moved on, and friendships can dissolve under the weight of time. Some exonerees find themselves emotionally estranged from the very people who advocated for their release. Trust becomes fragile, not only toward institutions, but toward human connection itself. Yet, amid these challenges, resilience emerges. Many exonerees channel their experience into advocacy, education, and reform. They become voices for systemic change, working with innocence projects, testifying on legal reforms, and mentoring the recently released. Their stories carry authenticity that no legal report or statistic can replicate. The lived reality of wrongful conviction serves as both a warning and a guidepost for justice reform. Consider the story of Carrie Max Cook, exonerated after more than 20 years on death row. Upon release, Cook faced intense psychological struggles, insomnia, flashbacks, and social disorientation. Yet, he transformed his experience into activism, helping to reform Texas' legal system and prevent future wrongful convictions. His work demonstrates that survival is not only about enduring imprisonment, but about finding a purpose in the aftermath, even when life feels irreversibly altered. A critical, often overlooked element is the community's role in post-exoneration adjustment. Exonerees frequently encounter suspicion or disbelief. The public may assume that a released prisoner remains dangerous, despite proof of innocence. The social stigma of incarceration persists, a paradoxical shadow of the very injustice that imprisoned them. Integration is a psychological and social balancing act, where exonerees must navigate the tension between freedom and the lingering presence of systemic doubt. The neuropsychological impact is equally profound. Studies from the APA and NIJ indicate that prolonged incarceration, especially under wrongful conviction, produces long-term effects on memory, attention, and executive function. Years spent in environments where survival depends on constant vigilance and mental control recalibrate cognitive patterns. Inmates develop coping strategies, meticulous routines, mental compartmentalization, and hyper-awareness that persist outside prison but often clash with the fluidity of normal life. This cognitive dissonance can make adjustment feel like learning to walk in a new world while carrying the shadow of the old one. Importantly, post-exoneration life exposes societal responsibility gaps. Legal systems may release the innocent, but support networks, psychological care, and social reintegration programs are often insufficient. The Chicago Crime Lab highlights that comprehensive reentry support is rare, leaving exonerees to confront the complexities of employment, housing, and healthcare largely alone. This lack of structured support risks re-traumatization, and in some cases, leads to isolation, substance abuse, or secondary psychological disorders. Despite these challenges, human resilience shines. Many exonerees rebuild identities from the fragments of their past. They engage in education, rebuild families, and form networks of mutual support. Some write memoirs. Others speak publicly about the psychological, legal, and societal dimensions of wrongful conviction. Their narratives are a testament to endurance. The same capacity that allowed them to survive decades behind bars now fuels their post-release journeys. Ultimately, the story of wrongful conviction is not confined to the prison walls. It continues long after exoneration, demanding recognition of both systemic failures and human resilience. Each exoneree carries the weight of lost years, the scars of unjust punishment, and the potential to illuminate pathways for reform. Society's challenge is to honor this resilience, provide meaningful support, and confront the structures that allow injustice to persist. The chapter closes with a sobering truth. Freedom does not erase injustice. It merely opens the door to rebuilding, confronting trauma, and advocating for change. And in this process, exonerees emerge not just as survivors, but as crucial agents in the ongoing fight for justice. Systemic lessons, reform, and the human cost of wrongful convictions. Wrongful convictions are rarely isolated incidents. They are often the visible tip of systemic failures. From flawed investigations to coercive interrogations, unreliable eyewitness testimony, and prosecutorial errors, the machinery of justice can malfunction in ways that irreparably alter lives. According to the National Institute of Justice, NJ, over 2,800 exonerations have been recorded in the U.S. since 1989, yet each case represents countless hours of lost freedom, emotional trauma, and human potential squandered. The first systemic lesson is the critical need for evidentiary rigor and safeguards. DNA testing, for example, has revolutionized the ability to identify wrongful convictions. The Innocence Project reports that DNA evidence has exonerated over 375 wrongfully convicted individuals who had served time on death row. However, these successes also underscore past failures. Often, convictions relied on circumstantial evidence, coerced confessions, or flawed forensic testimony, leaving innocent people trapped behind bars. Psychological coercion plays a significant role. Studies from the APA highlight that high-pressure interrogations can induce false confessions, especially in vulnerable populations such as juveniles or those with cognitive impairments. Exonerees often recount giving confessions under duress, fatigue, or fear, demonstrating the human cost of aggressive policing techniques. These confessions, once used as primary evidence, become a self-perpetuating cycle of injustice. Another lesson is the critical importance of competent legal representation. Many wrongful convictions occur because defendants lacked access to experienced counsel or faced under-resourced public defenders. Cases like that of Anthony Ray Hinton, who spent nearly 30 years on death row for crimes he did not commit, illustrate how systemic inequities, including racial bias, inadequate defense resources, and prosecutorial overreach, converge to produce life-altering injustice. Beyond the courtroom, the societal repercussions of wrongful convictions are profound. Families suffer, communities lose trust in law enforcement, and public confidence in the judicial system erodes. Children of the wrongfully convicted often face trauma, economic hardship, and social stigma. The ripple effects extend far beyond the individual, creating generational wounds that require deliberate intervention to heal. Exonerees themselves highlight a crucial, often underappreciated lesson. Rehabilitation begins after exoneration, not just incarceration. The psychological, social, and economic impacts of wrongful imprisonment demand structured post-release support. This includes access to mental health care, vocational training, housing, and community reintegration programs. The Chicago Crime Lab emphasizes that comprehensive support networks significantly improve outcomes, reducing the likelihood of long-term trauma, social isolation, or recidivism-related challenges. Legislative reform is also vital. States like California, Texas, and New York have introduced compensation statutes, DNA testing protocols, and innocence commissions. Yet gaps remain. Many exonerees report delays in receiving support or legal aid, leaving them vulnerable during the critical transition from incarceration to freedom. Systemic reform must therefore be holistic, addressing legal safeguards, psychological recovery, and societal reintegration simultaneously. A particularly striking lesson is the psychological resilience of the human spirit. Despite decades of wrongful imprisonment, exonerees often display extraordinary endurance, adapting to life outside prison while advocating for others. Their experiences illuminate not only systemic failure, but also the untapped capacity for human resilience. Mental coping strategies developed in prison, patience, discipline, problem-solving, often become tools for post-release advocacy, education, and personal reinvention. Consider the story of Joyce and Brown, wrongfully imprisoned for 6 years in Texas. Upon release, Brown channeled her trauma into activism, campaigning for legal reform and mentoring other exonerees. Her story illustrates a critical truth. The human mind, even when subjected to extreme injustice, can convert trauma into purpose, transforming individuals' suffering into societal benefit. Yet the overarching lesson is sobering. Justice delayed is justice denied. Each wrongful conviction represents a failure of systems designed to protect the innocent, enforce accountability, and maintain societal trust. As Haney and Irwin argue, these failures underscore the need for continuous oversight, transparent procedures, and a culture of ethical accountability across every level of law enforcement and the judiciary. For viewers, understanding these cases is more than a cautionary tale. It is a call to awareness and action. Recognizing the human cost of wrongful convictions, lost years, fractured families, psychological trauma, is essential to cultivating empathy and demanding reform. Exonerees are not just survivors. They're living testimonies of what happens when justice falters. Their voices reveal the fragility of our systems, the perseverance of the human spirit, and the imperative to strive for a more just society. As this documentary unfolds, remember that the fight for justice is ongoing. Every exoneree's story challenges us to question, to empathize, and to advocate. When justice fails, the consequences extend far beyond the courtroom, shaping lives in ways we can barely imagine. But through awareness, reform, and support, we can honor the resilience of the innocent, prevent future injustice, and create a society that truly values truth over expedience. If you found these stories compelling and want to continue exploring the realities behind the walls of our justice system, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join us as we uncover the untold truths, challenge systemic failures, and give voice to those who have survived the unthinkable.